So it turns out that Kamala Harris is a liar and a plagiarist, just like her boss, Joe Biden. People of a certain age will probably remember that President Biden was forced to drop out of the race for the first time when he ran for president back in 1988, after a much more honest media at that time reported that Biden copied a speech from a little-known British member of parliament, almost word for word.
Why is it that Joe Biden is the first in his family ever to go to a university?
Why am I the first connect in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
Why is it that my wife, who's sitting out there in the audience, is the first in her family to ever go to college?
Why is Glenys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university?
No, it's not because they weren't as smart. It's not because they didn't work as hard. It's because they didn't have a platform upon which to stand.
Does anybody really think that they didn't get what we had because they didn't have the talent or the strength or the endurance or the commitment? Of course not. It was because there was no platform upon which they could stand.
All right, so Joe Biden would drop out of the race less than a month after all that went public and not run for president again for 20 years. And it looks like Kamala Harris did the exact same thing. In an interview with Elle magazine just before the 2020 election, Harris told a story about her parents at a civil rights march in Oakland, California in the 1960s. Take a look.
There's a funny family story about how, so my mother's marching with the extended family. I talk about like Aunt Mary and Uncle Freddie in the book. And she would tell the story about how, so they're marching. And this is back when strollers didn't really have armrests and seatbelts. So they're marching away and, you know, shouting and all of that. And then I think it was my Uncle Freddie, you know, looked down and looked in the stroller, which was empty. And said, "Where's Kamala?" And apparently they left me like a block behind. I'd fallen out the stroller. There you go. And then my mother would tell a funny story about how, like, one day and I was fussing, and you know, and so I'm fussing and fussing. It's much cuter when she would tell the story, but she'd say, so then she would look down at me and, "Kamala, what do you want? What do you want?" And I looked back up at her and I said, "Freedom."
Freedom. It's a sweet story. The problem is, it's not her story. Just like her boss in 1988, Joe Biden, she stole that story from Dr. Martin Luther King, who in a 1965 interview with Playboy magazine told the exact same story. Here it is. Quote, "I will never forget the moment in Birmingham, Alabama, when a white policeman accosted a little girl 7 or 8 years old who was walking. 'What do you want?' And the little girl looked at him straight in the eye and answered, 'Freedom.'" This probably explains why Harris doesn't do interviews. She is impressive on paper, but there's just not anything there. She's like a politician that AI would create if you typed in Democratic politician in 2024. She is not Barack Obama. She does not have his coalition. And I highly doubt that Kamala is going to drop out of the race after this report. But here we are, 19 days and counting since Joe Biden dropped out of the race and made history, and we're all still waiting on Kamala to sit down for a single interview.